The funny thing about what I thought was success was seeing someone in the street wearing our T-shirt for the first time. That's when I knew, yes, like we've arrived.
Well, I brought my Anthrax T-shirt along so that we can get a picture afterwards.
Awesome.
The reason that I love metal is not that it's so different than classical, but because it's actually so similar. And there have now been these scientific studies about how there are many people out there who listen to only metal and classical, or that the personality types of metal fans and classical fans are very close, or this or that or the other. And I mean, not all metal, because there's obviously is dumb stuff, but the good stuff, like particularly thrash. I mean, for me, that's my genre.
Well, it's funny you say that, because that genre, I think, is the closest to that form of music, which is classical music. Like we were talking earlier, like Stravinsky was one that I would always listen to and just find pieces that he would do that was really close to the way we were structuring our songs, So why was he the one, though? I mean, I'm sure you'll tell me oh no, if you listen to this piece by Bach, or you'll hear that as well.
Yeah, well, it's a progression in that direction, and you always wonder, if these other types of instruments, the big drum kits and the electric guitars and amplification to that degree had existed, what might these musicians have done?
Right, exactly.
With those other options. But I mean, I love the acoustic sound, just the visceral sense of creating everything you do with your instrument with your own hands instead of pushing buttons. But at the same time, a lot of times I feel like what I'm trying to capture with my old-fashioned instrument is really channeling something from today's world, and trying to create for the experience of the listeners at my concerts something of the same effect that they get when listening to plugged-in music.
Well, it's interesting. If they could have pushed it further, of course, having an electrical instrument, which is impossible, but what would it have been like, I'm sure they tried to push the boundaries as much as they possibly could, but...
Well, and the other side of the coin is, if a talented musician like you had lived 100 years earlier, you probably would have been composing symphonies that we would now be playing today.
That's true, but I think of it as this music that we've created. Some of our songs are 6-8 minutes long, so I consider them little mini symphonies, with... 5 guys. I mean, because in our music too, I always thought of the vocalist as the other instrument, and then especially with bands that have come out, extreme type of bands where you're using the vocal as another instrument.
Well, now it's more sound effect or percussion or something instead of actual pitches.
Well, in the beginning when it first started, people would call it kind of Cookie Monster sounding vocals. But it was a part of the band. It was another instrument, just another layer of it. And you can't tell what they're saying, but does that really matter?
Exactly. I didn't figure out what Joey Belladonna was singing until I started doing Anthrax karaoke.
Do you have that?
Well, not at the actual karaoke bars, but you can basically those songs are on YouTube as karaoke versions.
That's right,
so then you can just make the DJ put one on. I did Among the Living.
Oh wow, I didn't know
last
that.
year. Speaking of your old albums, so what was it your idea to use a cello on Be All End All?
Yes.
And what sort of led you in that direction?
Because I love the cello. It's probably one of my favorite instruments. Cello just had this haunting sound to it, and I just loved it. So that was, the inspiration was because it was so haunting. I just wanted it to open the record that way.
Did the cellist that you hired to play those few measures realize what an honor it was to play on an Anthrax song?
I don't think so.
That's what I suspected.
Our last album, we had another celloist on it, ALISON.
Oh yeah,
do you know
absolutely.
ALISON?
She's local.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
She used to go by HELEN.
Right.
But she's awesome too. As a matter of fact, I saw her about 3 years ago at the Grammys. I haven't seen her since, and I saw her. She's like, "Hey," I'm like, "Hey." So she was awesome to work with, though. She knew exactly what to do, and again, it's all in the fingers, the tone, how she,
Yeah, well, that's the thing about our instruments, that so much of what we do is actually athletic or physical. It's how, the refinement, very subtle movements of the bow on the string to create all of these colors and nuances that give life to the music that we're creating.
It's emotional.
And my friends who play electric violin, I mean, I play electric, but because I was in a doom thrash band, you've got your clean and your dirty, and I let the other guitarists do the wah solo, and, I'm like, fine. But people who use, like, really a lot of pedals to create a lot of colors, like, somehow I love hearing them, and I really respect what they do, but that's not where I'm coming from artistically, and I just don't think I could ever get into it because it feels like too separate from me.
Mm-hmm. Too processed?
Well, no, I don't think of it as artificial. I just think, like, even having my sound come out of an amplifier, like, that was freeing because I could now be in a different relationship to the audience than I'd been my entire life, with the acoustic sound holes having to face this way, and so my body had to be this way to the crowd, and that's the one and only option. And now I could turn like this or turn like this, and it didn't matter because my sound was coming out of there. Right. That was kind of like mind-blowing. Right. You probably think that's pretty silly, but it was radical for me. But on the other hand, I never did get used to my sound not being right there where my body was.
Right, so it's resonating. Through you.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think the same thing with drummers, because drumming, it's an acoustic instrument. Yeah. And the hardest part for me throughout all these years of playing live is the band was louder than me. You know what I mean? Because when I'm playing by myself solo, it sounds great. Once they all play, everything I drop down. I can't hear it. So it's hard to, and that's what we talked about earlier about, I love being in the studio more than I do playing live. It's just little things like that.
I want to hear about that. Is that because you have more control over what's going on, or?
Because there's two reasons. It just doesn't sound right to me sometimes when we play live. For that aspect, the reason of I just don't hear myself the way I should hear myself, and you're just replaying what you did night after night.
Rather than creating new ideas or new things.
Yeah, and it just gets a little boring for me, that's all. So that's why I try and change it a bit. There'll be like a 2-week period where I'll play the song the way it was, and then one night I'll just go off and just re-edit the songs. And that's when you get the look backs like that. Like, what's going on?
Well, that's the interesting thing. So, like in classical, we're obviously playing something that somebody else composed, and we're playing the notes that person wrote, at least from the 1800s on, when you stopped improvising notes nearly as much. But the way that we play the notes can be definitely different. I mean, you don't want to be so different that the people you're playing with get thrown for a total loop. But within a sort of general framework, you have a lot of room for spontaneous inspiration, for how long you're going to hold that note before you go on to the next, because we're not locked into a backbeat in the same way.
So who's controlling the time?
Well, when there's a conductor, the conductor actually shapes the entire thing, and you have to follow him or her, and you'd better do so. But
I always wondered about that.
When there's a soloist, the soloist actually is the one who's in the driver's seat, and then the conductor follows the soloist, and the orchestra follows the conductor. When it's a smaller group with no conductor, like a string quartet, or if I'm just playing with me and a pianist, then it's really just a kind of collective consciousness. You actually have to breathe together and feel each other and trust each other. And of course, there are physical cues, looking at each other, showing with your arm movements and head movements and so forth how you're going to make this phrase go.
So it's kind of controlled chaos.
I've never heard it described that way, but that's absolutely accurate.
It's like
you've made decisions ahead of time, but in that moment, you can't just lock into the beat and play your part. You have to be totally aware of everybody around you and how they might be, doing it very extemporaneously in that moment, and make sure that you don't get off from them. Well, that's what I always tell people is like, okay, it's not amplified, but the intensity of 100 people on stage playing that kind of music, it's just as crazy as any metal band.
And how do you control the sound?
Well, and that's the thing. It's not a sound guy at the board balancing musicians. They've got to gradate their decibels against each other and do it do it in a tactile way with their instruments, so that everything, the whole texture, all put together works.
Right.
And that takes so much training and experience.
Because back in the day when you used to record live as a band in the studio and you used to go for takes, it's like, okay, this part I have to take it back a bit to let that guy shine. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I always wondered about having in the symphony, because there's so many dynamics. How do I not hit this dynamic but not be super loud,
No, that's what rehearsal is for, right?
Oh, okay. But still, it's the excitement of playing live that, you just take it somewhere else.
Yeah, and maybe somebody else does something that wasn't quite like rehearsal, so then you got to respond, and somebody else responds to you. So that's why what you get in live performance is not going to be like you hear on any other album, and that's why I love making CDs, don't get me wrong. It's a great way to sort of preserve my thoughts about something for posterity and share it with the world, but live in concert for me, because of that spontaneity, is something more exciting than you're ever going to get in the studio, because you're almost like you're creating that music in that moment. And in the studio, you're actually trying for a certain kind of consistency, the kind you say that you actually do on the road, because if there was an issue where maybe one person was a little out of tune, or maybe there was a flaw in the tone, or maybe the ensemble wasn't quite tight, you got to be able to splice, and you got to have the takes be similar enough that you can splice between them without losing the flow of the piece.
Of course.
So you're actually in a way more restricted.
Oh.
So going back to your roots, you say you started drumming away when you were 3 years old, which is when I started fiddling. But at what point did you realize, like, this is my life's work, or I want to do this professionally, or anything like that?
The first concert that I ever went to, I saw David Bowie, and my cousin brought me, and I was young. I was probably like
Great first concert.
8 or 9 years old. It was at the Garden, and I remember having two types of emotion. The first was I was a bit like scared at the environment, and then my next emotion was complete, like, oh my God, this is it,
Like you want to be on that side of the stage.
Yeah. And that's when I realized, and then other things happened after that. Like I saw Kiss for the first time, and that completed me. Yeah, it's true. And that was it. How did you know this is it? I'm doing this.
Well, I grew up playing violin in my church. It was actually in my church where I first heard the great music of Bach and other composers, because our organist would play toccatas and fugues for the prelude music, and the choir would be singing movements of Handel or Mendelssohn oratorios. And so it was like this great music. But interestingly, it wasn't really concerts. It was just this act of worship where the people playing the music and the people listening to the music were kind of in it together, that it wasn't this divide between the performers on stage and the people in the audience. So that sense of music making, where the musicians are channeling something greater than themselves and then sharing it with the people who are listening, like, that's really what I wanted to do. And I was inspired to start violin because I saw some older girls playing in my church when I was 3, and then I myself started playing in church when I was 4, and by the time I was 5, I just knew that this was what I was meant to do with my life. And my parents were like, wait, can you earn a living? And then they kind of figured out that you could, so they're like, well, I guess we'll let her.
That's awesome. It's like,
it's very lucky.
But well, your parents were supportive. My mother and my sisters were always supportive. They would take me to drum lessons, you know what I mean?
Fantastic.
Do everything. I remember.
Well, it's one thing to allow violin to be practiced in the house, but to allow drums to be practiced in the house, right?
It was nuts. I remember when I was 16 years old, 15 or 16, and I was in a band. And I remember my sisters helping me pack the drums up in the car, and they would drive me to the gig. And it was at this place in an area called City Island, and there were bars there. But I couldn't go through the front door because I wasn't of age. So I had to go through the back, and I had to stay back there. And I would play 3 sets, and it was crazy. But I remember that experience. That's how I think I developed all my drumming chops, playing 3 sets of just insane songs, everything from the Cars to Pink Floyd to Yes to the Who. It was just nuts.
Well, do you think playing other people's music is a great way to find the path towards developing your own individual style?
It helps so much, because sometimes it's a challenge to actually get it to where you know, okay, this sounds good. And you learn so much about playing, how they played it, how they approached it, their timing, why did they put this fill there. So I totally would say yes. I would say people play along to these songs. It helps you develop your timing and a sense of, musicality too.
Absolutely. It's similar in classical, of course. I'm unusual in that I actually do write some of my own stuff. Not a big, sonata or something, but I'll write a lot of my own cadenzas and encores and different compositions like that. But
That's awesome.
in terms of interpreting the music, because it is so personal and that one piece can be played a million different ways in terms of, like I was saying earlier, the timing of it and the colors and the nuances. Playing along to famous violinists like dead ones and alive ones and everybody. When you're a little kid, I do that a lot. Get an LP record from the library and then just stand there and play with it and feel what they were doing from actually trying to recreate it in some way rather than just listening. And that helped me understand what was really happening.
Who were your favorites growing up?
Well, the interesting thing is listening so analytically, and this is why I started listening to metal. I couldn't have a favorite. I mean, I loved listening to Anna-Sophie Mutter play Bruch, or Perlman play the 24 Caprices, or Oistrakh play the Cacciatorian Concerto. But maybe I liked this person's Brahms, but not their Beethoven, or this person's Mozart, but not their Bach. Or I liked the way that their vibrato was, but not their accents. So it was like very compartmentalized for me somehow. Cellists, I could listen to Yo-Yo Ma, and I could listen to Jacqueline Dupre and Rostropovich, and because I wasn't playing the cello, I could listen to them more sort of openly and just enjoy. But violinists, it was always like, in a good way, but kind of like picking over every detail.
It's funny you mentioned vibrato, and I've always been one to wonder, how do you develop that vibrato? Because some people just have it.
You want some really annoying, time-consuming, tedious exercises?
Yeah.
Like going to the gym and doing some kind of reps, just something really boring. But it's a physical skill,
Yeah.
So you have to work out like an athlete, and then once you have those actions of your muscles at your disposal, then you can use them for artistic ends.
I get this question a lot about what could you tell a young artist coming up? Was there anything that you could say that you wish someone would have said to you? Sometimes I think about it and I go, I wouldn't have listened anyway if someone would have said, don't do this. You have to do it. How could you not do it when it's burning inside of you? You're so passionate about it. So the thing I do say to them is, do your best version of you. Don't do a version of something else that you're just copying.
Exactly. Don't do what you think the critics are going to like. Don't do what you think is going to be commercially successful, because even if you become successful and it works, you're going to be left empty inside.
Right. And you have to follow that up with something equally as good as you just did. For me, it's just like, if you're in a band, practice as much as you guys possibly could, because you're never going to be prepared for when you get into it. Because you're friends and everything's great, and then it becomes a business. And that's when it turns. It doesn't become that great thing that it once was. It becomes a business.
Well, for me, I'm lucky that there are a lot of things that I did learn as a young person that I'm glad I know, like the importance of sharing your music beyond the concert hall, going and educating young people wherever you go and playing your music in unusual places. Like, I'll never forget when I was 16 and I went and played for some inmates at Cook County Jail.
Whoa.
And that was one of the most meaningful concerts I did that year.
Really?
I've played in hospitals. I just played at a homeless shelter in D.C. And I learned that through my church, obviously, just the importance of uplifting people's spirits with music wherever you might be able to play for them.
That's awesome.
And then when you get out on stage and you're hired, it's a gig, there's a check, you have to pay your rent, but on the other hand, somehow you don't feel like this is a job or this is an ego trip, but you feel like even in the regular concerts, that you're still there to just play for people because that's what you do, and it doesn't matter where it is.
I think the greatest thing about like what you just said, for me, is like some of the shows that we'll play. I don't even know where I am sometimes because I just go off somewhere else. Like I won't even look. I'll just stay behind my kit and before I know it, wow, we're 8 songs into it. know what I mean? I went somewhere else.
Yeah, that's the best.
Yeah, that's the
You're in that
best.
zone.